Welcome back to Know Your Rights New Jersey. I'm your host, Reinhold Ponder. And today we continue our discussions on immigration issues. Once again, we have here our great friend and one of my favorite guests, David Nachman.
Thanks so much, Ron.
It's good to see you again. And joining us today is Snehal Batra.
Batra, thank you.
And today we're going to discuss naturalization. And let's get right into that. And Snehal, if I can start with you, tell us what naturalization is and what the process is.
Okay, sure. So naturalization is when a lawful permanent resident of the United States applies for U.S. citizenship. So it's a process of becoming a naturalized U.S. citizen. The process entails filling out an application. And the eligibility requirements are that you must be a lawful permanent resident of the United States for at least 5 years, or 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen. You must be 18 or over. You must be a person of good moral character, have continuous and physical presence in the United States. So these are the eligibility criteria to file for naturalization.
So what is the process? How do you go about becoming?
Okay, so once you've satisfied these requirements, so you've been a permanent resident for 5 years in the United States, you've been physically present for half that time, and you have continuous residence, you make a formal application process. And you file that application, which is filed on Form N-400, with the U.S. CIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. There's also a filing fee with that. The filing fee is now $725. You submit the application, you get called in for a naturalization exam. Part of becoming a citizen, you have to pass the English test. So that entails being able to read, speak, and write English. And there's also a civics test component. So you have to answer questions about U.S. government and U.S. history. And if you pass the naturalization exam, then you get sworn in to become a U.S. citizen, which then entitles you to a U.S. passport and so on and so forth.
So are there any responsibilities that come with becoming a U.S. citizen?
Well, there are rights and responsibilities. So some of the responsibilities include you have to defend the U.S. Constitution. You have to, if you're called to serve in the armed forces, you have to be willing to do that. You also have to forego other foreign allegiances. So you have to give up your citizenship, basically, of your country of birth. And some of the rights of becoming a citizen include you have the ability to vote. Okay, so that's major. You also can serve on a federal jury. Okay, you can also apply for some federal jobs. So these are some of the rights of becoming a U.S. citizen. And the key also for a lot of people is you have the ability to petition for other family members to come to the United States. So, that's a big one.
Well, David, Snehal gave us a good idea, or an accurate idea of what the qualifications are. What are some of the issues that can sneak up to impact the application?
Well, some of the nuances I think that we've seen, and every case, of course, is different. It has to do with physical presence in the United States. Oftentimes, we're dealing with individuals who, once they get their green cards, they frequently travel outside the United States for extended periods of time. And then they will come and they'll ask us questions about, can we apply for citizenship? And they can apply for citizenship, but they have to have accumulated physical presence in the U.S. for at least 1/2 of the 5 years if they're waiting 5 years, or 1/2 of the 3 years if they're waiting 3 years. Another nuance that I've encountered has to do with the fact that an individual sometimes is not able to learn. They're not able to learn the civics, or they're not able to write English. And the government does allow, of course, for what's called a medical disability waiver. It's done on an N648, and oftentimes we have to work with the doctors
Right.
to explain to them what exactly needs to go into this type of a report to ensure that the reason why the person can't learn is tied to something that is a medical situation that they may have in their background. So these are some of the nuances that we've encountered.
And obviously, this is a very important process for those who are trying to become naturalized.
Tremendous, absolutely tremendous. Yeah. I think I just also want to go to one of the things
Please.
that Snehal had mentioned before, which is she had mentioned giving up the citizenship from their home country.
Yes.
One of the big questions which we often get has to do with dual citizenship. And there are very few countries in the world where you actually have to relinquish a passport from your home country. So you can actually hold on to the passports from the foreign country. So for example, you can be a dual citizen. We get this a lot of times from Canadians who are in the United States who may marry a U.S. citizen and they've had the green card for the requisite period of time. And they say, oh, well, if I become a U.S. citizen,
Right.
do I have to give up the Canadian passport? And they don't. They don't have to give up the Canadian passport. They actually can travel with both passports. So it becomes an issue. It's kind of interesting when you become a U.S. citizen. You're a U.S. citizen in the eyes of the United States, and so when you travel abroad, it really is a question of where you're traveling, whether you are a citizen of that country or not. You'll always be a citizen of the United States, but if you're in the U.S., then you're deemed to be a U.S.
Right.
citizen.
So that's part of the oath requirement. So when you apply for naturalization, you are administered an oath to become a U.S. citizen. So part of that oath requirement is relinquishing your citizenship of your country of birth. So that's where this all comes into play.
Do you ever get an opportunity to go and see your clients take the oath?
Not all the time, but some clients, yes,
Sometimes,
we
yeah.
we accompany them to their naturalization interviews.
Well,
And a lot of times it's done in a group environment too.
I ask that because I know that must be a joyful time for you too, because
course.
it's such a great accomplishment.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the relationship between green card job holders and the naturalization process.
Okay, well, I think that we kind of touched upon that in the beginning when we talked about how do you become a naturalized citizen. So
Versus family-based.
Okay, so there's really no difference.
Okay.
The requirement is you must be a lawful permanent resident, either for 5 years or 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen, to be able to apply for naturalization. The process is no different if you have your green card based on a employment-based or family-based.
Are there any red flags that pop up in the process that we should be aware of?
Sure, part of the naturalization process is you must demonstrate good moral character. So if you have any arrests, if you haven't paid your taxes, if you owe back child support, these are issues that would demonstrate a lack of good moral character. So it's very important that if you have any of these issues that you speak with qualified attorney to go over these things so that you don't run into problems, not only with acquiring U.S. citizenship, but potentially losing your green card.
Yeah, the issue runs into an area of law which sort of touches and concerns immigration. We call it crimigation.
Oh.
Where what we do, right, exactly. So what we do is we look at the crime and we make a determination as to whether or not the crime is going to impact the individual's ability to get citizenship. So there is, like Snehal was saying, there's a requirement for good moral character, and they have to demonstrate good moral character for 5 years. So
For example, what about not paying 30 parking tickets?
Well, I guess it depends on the officer.
Right.
If parking tickets generally are not an issue. Traffic tickets generally not an issue. DWIs, those are more of an issue. If you have one DWI, I've been successful in being able to overcome a DWI even though it was within the 5 years. Several DUIs, I don't know. Then
Right.
you're really in an area where I think that you would probably want to wait the full 5 years before you file for citizenship.
So does the current environment, which seems to be a very anti-immigration environment in this country, does it, one, impact the naturalization process, and secondly, and specifically, does it bring on an added scrutiny regarding criminality?
I think for sure. I mean, number one, and I think I speak for Snehal when I say that we've seen a tremendous uptick in the number of people who are applying for naturalization because I think that what they're realizing, see, when you have a green card, and I'll give you an example. I always tell my clients this example, is that I had a client many years ago who I said, you qualify for citizenship, why don't you apply? For many years, I told him. And then he moved down to Texas. He was driving a car down in Texas. One morning, he got a fare. He was driving in a neighborhood, and a little girl darted out in front of his car. And it was an accident, of course, but it was vehicular homicide. And because of that, and he was not a citizen, he was a green card holder, he was deported. Now, had he listened to me and gotten his citizenship, then that accident wouldn't have ended up resulting in a deportation. So, it's a difference of the way a crime is treated as against a U.S. citizen versus the way it's treated as against a person who has a green card. So it's always best that when you qualify for citizenship, to go ahead and do it. Why not do it? That's
especially
really
if you're going
question.
to be living and working in the United States. I mean, it makes sense to do that.
Sure, and the opportunity to vote.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people who I'm talking to now feel that, things may not be in the situation that we have with the government being in such a tumultuous mess if they had the opportunity to go to the polls in the last election and to have their voice heard. So, of course, that's a very strong reason that pulls people to become U.S. citizens.
Well, this is a good time to take a pause for our break. Welcome back to Know Your Rights, New Jersey. I'm here with David and Snehal, and we're discussing naturalization. We just ended briefly our discussion on criminalization, or as you called it,
Crimmigration.
crimmigration, the complication of criminal and immigration. Let's talk a little bit about expungements and their role in
Expungements, right. So most people believe that when you have a record expunged, that you don't have to disclose this, that it's erased from your history. While that might be true in terms of when you apply for jobs, if you've had an expungement, it's not true for the naturalization process. Even if you have an expunged record, you must disclose that on the application. So that's important for people to understand, that you have to answer that properly in the application. Have you ever been arrested? Yes or no?
But if it's expunged, would anyone know? If it's expunged, would anyone know that you were arrested?
It probably wouldn't come up in the records check if the record was expunged, but it's a question of whether or not you're lying.
Okay.
So it's not. The question isn't, do you have an expunged record? It's, have you ever been arrested? So it must be disclosed.
And so that would be considered a lie. If
right,
not.
and then again, it goes against, good moral character.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think it's important to also point out to the viewers that the way it works with any crime in immigration is that you can't get rid of it. You can't expunge crime. So it's for non-immigrants, for green card, for citizenship. If you have a crime, it cannot be made to go away by way of an expungement. So I think that's an important point. Yeah, and there are several types of crimes. I think that it's important to let the viewers know that you have a couple of different. You have what are called de minimis crimes, where if you have individuals who are charged with less than a year of jail time, then those are considered to be de minimis. And de minimis, those are not really. They're not bad crimes. They're what are called crimes of moral turpitude, which can be bad crimes or not bad crimes. And then you have something called aggravated felonies, which are very bad crimes. And so each crime, depending upon its classification, impacts on an individual's ability to get a particular type of status or their ability to enter the United States or not enter the United States. aggravated felonies make people actually removable. So,
Right.
so these are, the classification of the crime is very important. And what's also important is that obviously criminal law is different from state to state. So if you have a crime in, let's say, Pennsylvania, that crime may be interpreted a certain way in Pennsylvania, but may not necessarily be interpreted the same way, for federal purposes. So you have to look at the crime itself.
Is there a gray area between de minimis crimes and higher level?
There are, and so, the area of crimigation is a very specialized area. And,
Right.
what we often do is we say the best thing that you would want to do is enlist the services of a criminal lawyer who's working with an immigration lawyer to analyze that crime and the potential impact on a person's immigration status, or to find an immigration lawyer who actually has a background in criminal law.
Right.
So this again has become a sort of subspecialty within the immigration field.
Okay. Let's talk about what happens if your application is denied.
Okay, well, that is going to depend on the reason for the denial.
Okay.
So let's say you're not able to pass the naturalization exam, you fail the civics test, then you have they do give you the option to retake the test. You have another opportunity. If it's denied because of an issue with maybe good moral character, then you could wait another, 5 years and reapply for naturalization. So you have the ability to reapply.
What are there any other reasons for denial of application and can you give us an example of how you would resolve?
So the one requirement, of course, in becoming a citizen is having continuous and physical presence. So I think I've seen these issues come up with clients that decide to file their own application. Maybe they're not that familiar with exactly how this works with continuous and physical presence, so they may not actually meet the eligibility requirement because they traveled outside the United States more than 6 months, which breaks the continuous residency requirement, which means now you have to start over the counting of the 5 years. So that's really where I've come across it.
Let's go to another issue, if you don't mind. The administration, specifically Donald Trump, has raised this thing called chain migration,
Right.
which seems to be putting fear. This always goes back to this fear in the minds of Americans about immigrants. What is this?
So chain migration is a derogatory term that's used by President Trump to define how permanent residents and citizens petition for their relatives to come to the United States. So he says that it's like a loophole to allow uneducated, underqualified criminals into the country through family-based immigration. That's not true. In practice, just because in reality, if you become a citizen, you don't automatically get to bring your relatives over to the United States. It's a process. We have already systems in place that allow for sponsorship of family members based on the degree of relationship. So for instance, U.S. citizens can petition for immediate relatives, which include their spouses, children, and parents. Lawful permanent residents can petition their spouses, children under 21, and then adult sons and daughters. And the U.S. citizens also have the ability to petition for their married children and also their siblings. So these are the family relatives that are able to be sponsored. You hear stuff in the news constantly about chain migration, about bringing nieces and nephews, grandparents, aunts and uncles, but that's not part of our quota system. And there are already caps on the number of different types of petitions that can be granted, and then there are also limits on per country limitations. So certain countries are oversubscribed, Mexico, Philippines, and India. So these countries, there's huge visa backlogs. So for instance, if you're a U.S. citizen from India and you want to petition your brother or sister, that wait is, decades. Your sister or brother potentially are waiting outside the United States for possibly, 20 years, I think it is, before they're able to immigrate. So this chain migration concept is just, not really the reality of our immigration system.
And the way you can check these backlogs is there's a document that's put out by the U.S. Department of State. It's called the Visa Bulletin. And there are charts which show the backlogs depending upon the family classification that you're
Right.
applying in. So you can look to see when a person has applied and then they get an approval of their application, they can track the date against what they're currently processing. And you can try to figure out how long it's going to take. So like Snehal's saying is that some of these classifications, for example, Philippine brother, sister, I think is backlogged like almost 15, 20 years.
Right.
So it's a tremendous backlog, but it kind of shows how crazy what the president is saying. And I guess I like the word you used is derogatory, because
Right.
it's really a derogatory way of describing a system that's really in place and that gives a roadmap to the government about how this is all going to work.
Are there advocates or immigration attorneys like yourself who are doing other things besides appearing on shows like this to correct this incorrect information that's coming from the president?
I would assume so. I mean, I've read many editorials. I think a lot of people are writing. There was an excellent article that I read over the weekend about the El Salvadorian issue with TPS and what people were going to be doing. And I think that the author of that article really did a nice job of laying out all of the options that were available and sort of taking on the government with regard to, why is this being done away with and so on. There are other NGOs. I think the NGOs have been very active. I know that there was a march, I think on Saturday or Friday, for the DACA people, who are looking to get some guidance from the government on what the future of DACA is. Yeah.
I'd like to add, there's also AILA, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association,
Yeah.
which is an organization that both David and I are members of. And so they have really great resources for advocates, for individuals that are concerned about what's going on. It's a very good resource for up-and-coming things that are taking place, alerts, how to get involved in your community. So that's also a great tool.
We do another thing, which is kind of a backdoor way to, I guess you could say a backdoor way of explaining, and that is that we go to the, next week, we're going to be going to the U.S. consulate office in India, and we're going to be speaking to the consular officials.
Right.
And a lot of the word that they get from that trickles down, I guess, without them actually reading a lot of the stuff, is, obviously it becomes sort of slanted in the direction that the administration wants to take. So what we do is when we sit with the officer, we kind of feel like it's an opportunity for us to explain things and explain the process and how it affects us in the trenches. And so it's almost like an educational opportunity talking to the administration itself. Obviously, it's not the big administration, but it's a piece of the administration that we deal with on a regular basis. So it gives us the opportunity to educate them.
Right.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we've been doing what really is turning out to be a series on immigration is to try to bring some clarity regarding all the confusing images, words, language, policies, and communication that's not really policy but impacts like policy. What is it? In one show we talked about H-1Bs and the impact that the administration has had on that process. Have the travel ban, comments on immigration had an impact on this naturalization process?
I don't know that the travel ban necessarily has had an impact. Well, maybe it has had an impact insofar as obviously folks who, I think that it certainly had a chilling effect where folks are coming to us and saying, let's apply for citizenship because we don't want to have problems when we travel. So if we travel as U.S. citizens, then we don't have to worry.
Yeah.
Whereas, although I think that the last thing that I had read, at least on the travel ban, was that people who are holding green cards shouldn't have a problem. But, I think what it does is it's almost it's a stimulus.
Right. It's
if you
mobilizing
will.
people
Yeah,
to actually
exactly.
make
Yeah.
the efforts, take steps to become naturalized citizens.
Well, we're approaching the end of the show, and as usual, I would like for you to tell us if there's anything else that our viewers should know that would be helpful or clarify what they need to know about naturalization process.
I think one of the things that we should have mentioned earlier is that when you apply for naturalization, you actually have the ability to legally change your name. So that's important for some people. So part of the naturalization process, it gives you the option to legally change your name. So you don't have to go through a separate procedure with the courts down the road to formally change your name.
A lot of people don't realize that the naturalization process is a court procedure. So it's done in the federal court. So it's sort of, where the federal court and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security are joining hands. And I think it's really important to point out to anyone who's doing naturalization that they make absolutely certain that when they see their certificate, before they leave that room, check to make sure all the information on it is accurate. Because if it's not accurate, you can't change it. It's written in stone. Yeah.
Well, you have to fill out another application. There's another fee. It's just a whole big big to-do.
But it's best to make sure all that information is accurate, because before you sign your naturalization certificate, you're given the opportunity to check the information. So just make sure that your name is spelled properly,
birth date.
the birth date is done properly. So you want to make sure that all that data is correct. Yeah.
Well, David and Snehal, once again, you've come up with great information for our viewers. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for having us.
And thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Know Your Rights.